A faint, desperate cry sliced through the icy Montana fog, stopping Ethan Harrison dead in his tracks as the negative 20-degree wind howled around him. Beneath the frozen crust of Echo Lake Reservoir, a dark shape thrashed. A bobcat, its golden eyes flickering like a dying ember. A predator, a killer. Yet its plea echoed hauntingly like his brother's voice from 20 years ago, lost forever in a deadly blizzard. At 58, once a celebrated wildlife photographer, but now a broken man haunted by the past, Ethan faced a chilling dilemma. Walk away or plunge into the lethal waters to save a savage beast. Could he outrun the ghost of Tommy Carter to rescue this creature? Or would the icy lake claim him instead? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. A faint cry tore through the icy fog, sharp as a knife plunging into Ethan Harrison's chest. He froze mid-step, the biting wind howling around him, his breath rising in white plumes against the minus 20-degree Montana cold. Beneath the surface of Echo Lake Reservoir, a dark shape thrashed, its golden eyes flickering like a dying flame through the thick mist. He squinted, straining to see past the thin, fractured ice crusting the water's edge. A bobcat, a predator, a threat. But why did that cry sound so much like his own, echoing back from the day he lost his brother in a blinding snowstorm 2 decades ago? Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his feet sinking into the fresh snow, his hands trembling inside thick gloves. The wind screamed through the pine trees, carrying a chill that sliced through skin and bone. But it wasn't the cold that made him shudder. It was memory. His little brother Tommy Carter's desperate voice rang from the past. "Jimmy, save me!" Before fading into the frozen night. He hadn't saved Tommy Carter. Not fast enough, not strong enough. And now, standing before this frozen lake, he heard another cry for help. Not human, but wild. A bobcat dying inch by inch in the frigid water, less than 30 steps from shore. He took a deep breath, the cold flooding his lungs like a punch. At 58, with aching knees riddled with arthritis and mental scars that never healed, Ethan was no hero anymore. Once he'd been a renowned wildlife photographer, spending his life chasing nature's rawest moments through a lens. Grizzlies roaring in mountain streams, eagles slicing through the sky. But now he was just an old man, alone in a small wooden cabin, his battered camera hung on the wall like a relic of better days. So why was he here on this frigid winter morning? Was it the strange, muted light filtering through the gray clouds? Or just a gut feeling pulling him from safety? The cry came again, fainter, more desperate. Ethan clenched his jaw, his eyes locking onto the bobcat. It wasn't thrashing hard anymore. Its front paws clawed feebly at the thin ice, claws leaving long scratches like the strokes of a despairing artist. Its head dipped under the water, then rose, droplets spilling from its once sleek fur, now matted and clinging to a gaunt frame. A proud predator, reduced to a tiny creature begging for life. He knew this species well, had photographed them hundreds of times, always from a safe distance. Bobcats weren't pets. They were phantoms of the deep woods, swift, fierce, ready to tear apart anyone foolish enough to get close when cornered. But those eyes, those blazing golden eyes, shimmering on the edge of death, held no trace of a predator's fury. They looked at him. No, they pleaded with him. A piercing gaze as if the animal knew he was its last hope. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He wanted to turn away. Every ounce of reason screamed at him, "This isn't your problem. It's wild, let it die." He could walk on, go home, brew a hot coffee, and pretend this never happened. But his feet wouldn't move. Those eyes held him fast, an invisible thread binding him to this moment. "Damn it," he muttered, voice hoarse. He knelt, slipping the camera bag off his shoulder, setting it on the snow with the care of someone who still cherished the memories it held. Then he shed his thick coat, exposing the thin wool sweater beneath. The wind attacked instantly, cold and ruthless, as if clawing at his flesh. He didn't care. He stared at the lake, calculating. The thin ice near the shore might hold his weight, But farther out, where the bobcat struggled, it was just water. Water so cold it could kill a man in minutes. He knew that. He'd read the stories, heard of people frozen solid in winter lakes. But he also knew if he did nothing, the bobcat would die, and he'd carry another ghost in his mind. Ethan stepped to the water's edge, his heavy boots cracking the thin ice, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the stillness. Cold water flooded over his ankles, seeping through the leather, stinging to the bone. He faltered, breath ragged, hands clenching into fists to fight the shaking. "Come on, you bastard," he growled to himself, voice lost in the wind. He glanced at the bobcat again. It was nearly still, head slumping, only those golden eyes faintly lifting, like a lantern flickering out in the dark. No time left to hesitate. He pushed forward, water rising to his knees, then his thighs. Each step was a battle, the lake bed slick with algae and ice, his legs numbing fast. He bit his lip hard enough to taste blood, forcing himself to stay alert. The bobcat was just a few yards away now, but the distance stretched like a lifetime. He reached out, water lapping at his waist, cold stabbing like 1,000 needles into his skin. "Don't die, little guy," he whispered, unsure if he was speaking to the animal or himself. Then he saw it clearly, a male bobcat, smaller than he'd thought, its sleek fur plastered to a bony frame. It wasn't fighting anymore, just floating there, head dipping under, shallow breaths puffing out thin wisps of vapor. A chill ran through Ethan, deeper than the water. It was dying. He lunged forward, heedless of the ice crumbling beneath him, water splashing around him. His trembling hands touched the creature, numb fingers sliding under its body. He braced for a scratch, a snap, the last wild instinct of a cornered predator. But nothing came. The bobcat lay still in his arms, so cold he couldn't tell if it was alive or already gone. Ethan clutched it to his chest, turning back to shore. The water dragged at him, each step heavy as if he carried the world. His breathing came in gasps, heart pounding wildly. He didn't know if he could make it, didn't know if the cold would claim him or the animal first. But those golden eyes, dim as they were, still watched him. And in that moment, Ethan knew he couldn't let go. Not this time. When his boots hit dry ground, he collapsed into the snow, the bobcat still cradled in his arms. He panted, water dripping from his hair onto its face. "You're alive, little guy," he said, voice quaking with cold and emotion. But a question lingered in his mind. Had he just saved a creature, or plunged himself into something bigger, something riskier? He didn't know. Yet as those golden eyes blinked faintly, as if in answer, Ethan felt an invisible thread tighten around his heart, a thread that would pull him into the days ahead, where the line between man and wild began to blur. Ethan collapsed into the snow, the bobcat icy in his arms, his breath escaping in broken white bursts. Water dripped from his hair onto its face, mingling with the melting ice on its matted fur. He just said something. "You're alive, little guy." But his voice cracked, trembling from the cold and an emotion he couldn't name. The animal's golden eyes blinked faintly, as if in response. Weak but alive. He'd done it. He'd pulled it from death's grip. But what now? His body was numb, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and the lake's chill clung to him like a relentless ghost. This wasn't the end. The fight had only begun. He inhaled sharply, trying to steady himself, but each breath sliced through his chest like a frozen blade. The bobcat lay still, too still, making panic claw at him, the fear it had died right there in his grasp. He leaned down, pressing his ear close to its muzzle. A faint puff of breath brushed his skin, carrying the damp scent of wet fur. Alive, still alive, but not for long, not unless he moved fast. Ethan gritted his teeth, scanning the scene. The frozen lake stretched out before him, wind howling through the pines, dragging Montana's deadly cold with it. His camera bag sat a few steps away, next to the coat he'd shed. Inside was an emergency blanket, thin, light, but enough to hold warmth. He needed it. Now he set the bobcat down in the snow, gentle as if laying down a child. It didn't resist, just lay there, golden eyes half closed, the light in them fading. "Don't die," he whispered, voice rough. He staggered to his feet, legs so numb they barely obeyed. One step, two. He stumbled, hands plunging into the snow, the cold seeping through his gloves. A growl rumbled in his throat as he forced himself to crawl to the camera bag. His trembling fingers fumbled with the zipper, digging inside. Finally, he yanked out the silver blanket, flimsy but glinting under the gray sky's dim light. Back at the Bobcat's side, Ethan wrapped it in the blanket, his movements clumsy from hands that felt nothing. He pulled it to his chest again, the small body so cold it was like holding a block of ice. He knew it couldn't last. Not in this cold, not like this. The Wildlife Rehab Center in Kalispell, 40 minutes by car, was its only shot. But his truck was parked nearly half a mile away, down a snow-choked trail. No time to think. He stood clutching the animal tight and started walking. Each step was a war. Snow swallowed his knees, the wind shoved back, like it wanted to knock him down. Then it hit him. Tommy Carter, his little brother, just 16, trapped in a blizzard 20 years ago. Ethan had found him, but too late. Tommy Carter had lain in his arms, cold and still, pale blue eyes wide but lifeless. "Jimmy, save me!" That cry echoed in his head now, blending with the wind's wail through the trees. He'd failed that day, not fast enough, not strong enough. But today was different. Today he wouldn't fail, not with this Bobcat. He gripped it tighter, steps quickening, though his legs quaked, threatening to give out. Halfway to the truck, the Bobcat stirred. Ethan froze, heart pounding. It twitched faintly, a weak shudder. He looked down into those golden eyes. They were brighter now, just a flicker, still drifting between life and death. "Hold on," he said, his voice steady now, firm. He broke into a near run, snow spraying underfoot. His head spun, cold, fear, memories of Tommy Carter. But he didn't stop, couldn't stop. When the old pickup came into view, Ethan nearly pitched forward into it. He yanked the door open, set the Bobcat on the passenger seat, the silver blanket catching the faint light. Climbing into the driver's seat, his shaking hands fumbled the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, heat blasting from the vents, but not fast enough to thaw the chill in his bones. He glanced at the animal. It lay there, breathing shallow and quick, golden eyes blinking slow. "You've got to live," he said, unsure if it was a command or a plea. The drive to Kalispell was a nightmare. Snow blanketed the trail, tires slipping more than once, forcing him to clench the wheel with gritted teeth. He cranked the heater full blast, but the wet clothes stuck to him, sending shivers through his frame. The Bobcat stayed quiet, too quiet, making him steal glances every few seconds. Once he caught it cracking its eyes open, looking at him, not with a predator's ferocity, but something deeper, as if it knew he was fighting for it. His throat tightened. He floored the gas. Road be damned. Halfway there, he called the rehab center. His trembling hand punched the numbers, voice breaking as he shouted into the phone. "I've got a Bobcat. It's waterlogged, freezing. I'm 20 minutes out. Be ready." A woman's voice, Dr. Abigail Martinez, he guessed, came through calm. "Get it here fast. We'll be waiting." He hung up, slamming a fist on the wheel. 20 minutes. Too long. But he had no choice. When the truck screeched through the gates of Northern Lights, Ethan could barely feel his legs. He threw the door open, scooped up the Bobcat, and stumbled out. Snow clung to his boots, wind whipping the silver blanket. A woman, Martinez, he assumed, stood at the entrance, sharp eyes scanning him and the bundle in his arms. "Get it in here," she yelled, voice commanding. Ethan lurched after her, numb hands still gripping the Bobcat tight. They burst into the treatment room, blinding white light making him blink. He set it on the table, gasping for air. Martinez and an assistant sprang into action. Machines beeped, voices snapped orders. Ethan stood there, water pooling from his clothes onto the floor, watching the Bobcat surrounded by skilled hands. It didn't move, but its breath held on, faint but there. Martinez turned to him, voice low. "It's alive, but we're not out of the woods yet. What the hell did you do to end up like this?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared at the Bobcat, its golden eyes now closed, and felt a surge crash through his chest. He dragged it from the water. He'd raced death down an icy road, But now, standing in this warm room, he realized the fight wasn't over. The cold, the fear, the ghost of Tommy Carter still clung to him. And this Bobcat, this tiny creature he'd risked everything for, lay in others' hands, teetering on the edge of life and death. He'd gotten it here. But what came next? He didn't know. Only that, in this moment, he wasn't just a man peering through a lens anymore. He was part of its story, a story that had just begun. Ethan stood there, water dripping from his soaked clothes onto the treatment room floor, his numb hands hanging limp at his sides. The harsh white light from the ceiling of Northern Lights Wildlife Rehab Center made him blink, but he couldn't tear his eyes from the Bobcat. It lay on the cold steel table, the crumpled silver blanket wrapped around its small frame, its shallow breasts puffing out in fragile wisps. Machines beeped. Dr. Abigail Martinez barked rapid orders to her assistant. "Check its temperature. Get the heating blanket." A chaotic symphony filling the air. Martinez turned to him, her sharp eyes peering from beneath hastily tied curly hair. "What the hell did you do to end up like this?" Her tone wasn't accusing, but astonished. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth was dry, his mind reeling, and something surged in his chest. Not joy, not fear, but a feeling he'd buried for 20 years. He stepped back, leaning against the wall, the room's heating system slowly seeping warmth through his drenched sweater. Martinez and her assistant buzzed around the Bobcat, taking its temperature, injecting meds, adding more heating blankets. Ethan watched them work, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. Tommy Carter, the little brother he couldn't save. He saw it again. Tommy Carter lying in the snow, lips purple, pale blue eyes wide but empty. He'd held him, screamed into the blizzard, but the cold stole him away before Ethan could do anything. For 2 decades, he'd fled that memory, diving into the wilderness, his camera lens a shield between him and the world. He'd photographed wildlife, chasing life in creatures he couldn't touch, couldn't save. But now this Bobcat, this tiny being he'd just pulled from icy water, had shattered that shield. He wasn't an outsider anymore. Martinez looked up from the table, wiping her hands on her white apron. "It's a male, about 3 years old," she said, her voice calm but tinged with surprise. "Core temps dangerously low, moderate malnutrition, but no serious injuries. You found it like this?" Ethan nodded, his voice raspy. "Stuck in the lake. Nearly dead." She studied him, then the Bobcat, her brows furrowing. "Normally they'd growl, scratch, even this week. But this one, it's strange. Barely fought back." She paused, observing the animal. Ethan followed her gaze. Its golden eyes cracked open, not fierce, not panicked, but curious. It glanced around, then settled on him, a slow blink, like a silent whisper. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Want to stick around?" Martinez asked, softer now. "We need to monitor it for a few hours. You could help if you want." Ethan hesitated. He wanted to go home, take a hot shower, sleep off the cold and the nightmare he'd just lived. But those eyes, those golden eyes staring from the steel table, held him there. "Sure," he heard himself say, as if someone else had spoken for him. Martinez nodded, handing him a dry towel and pointing to a corner. "Dry off, or you'll get sick before this cat does." The next few hours passed in a haze of exhaustion and adrenaline. Ethan sat on a hard plastic chair, watching the team at work. They checked the Bobcat's temperature every 15 minutes, gave more shots, monitored its pulse. Slowly, its breathing steadied, its body warming under the blankets. Martinez updated him now and then. "Temps up to 95 degrees. Much better." But Ethan didn't just listen. He watched how it lay still, how its small ears twitched at footsteps, how those golden eyes widened whenever he shifted. It wasn't scared, it wasn't hostile. It seemed to recognize him. Night fell, the center quieting, only the hum of the heater and the wind rattling the windows breaking the silence. Martinez approached, handing him a steaming coffee mug. "You don't have to stay," she said, but her tone hinted at an invitation, not a dismissal. Ethan took the mug, warmth seeping into his chilled hands. "I want to," he replied, eyes fixed on the Bobcat. It had been moved to a small glass enclosure now, the soft glow of a heat lamp shining on its drying fur, revealing the faint brown spots of its coat. Martinez sat beside him, studying him more than the animal. "What did you use to do that made you dive into an icy lake like that?" Ethan stayed quiet for a moment, fingers tightening around the mug. "I photographed wildlife," he said finally, "but not like this. I just didn't want to watch it die." He stopped, Tommy Carter's memory surging, but he held it back. Martinez didn't press. She just nodded, as if she grasped what he left unsaid. "It's lucky you were there. But you know, I've never seen a bobcat this calm in a situation like this. It looks at you differently." Ethan glanced up, meeting those golden eyes through the glass. A look not of a wild beast, but of a creature that knew it had been yanked back from the brink. He recalled photographing bobcats in the wild, always from afar, through a lens with a safe distance. They were shadows, predators, things he respected but never touched. Yet here it was, steps away, and he felt an invisible thread tying them together. Not friendship, not quite gratitude. Something deeper, more primal. The next day, the bobcat, now nicknamed Echo by the staff, after the lake where he'd found it, was moved to a larger recovery pen. Ethan stayed, not because Martinez asked, but because he couldn't leave. He helped set up the pen, brought water, sat outside watching. Echo grew stronger, but the strangeness didn't fade. When other staff approached, it shrank back, ears flattening, eyes wary. But when Ethan entered, it lifted its head, golden eyes brightening. No aggression, no retreat. Once, it even stepped close to the fence, less than a yard away, and sat there staring at him as if it had something to say. Martinez watched from a distance, jotting in her notebook. "I've never seen this," she told Ethan one afternoon, as Echo rested on a wooden perch in the pen, eyes tracking him. "Bobcats are solitary, don't like humans. But this one, it knows you saved it." Ethan didn't reply. He wasn't sure he believed it, yet every time Echo looked at him, he saw Tommy Carter. Not the boy who died in the snow, but the one who'd laughed with him by the river, who'd believed he was a hero. Saving Echo didn't erase the past, but it eased the ache, like a scar starting to heal. Days passed and Ethan spent more time at the center. He brought his camera, capturing Echo's recovery, the fur drying, muscles firming, golden eyes blazing with life again. But it wasn't just photos. He sat there hour after hour, feeling a strange bond with the creature he'd risked his life for. He didn't know how long it would last, or what would happen when Echo was strong enough to return to the wild. But one thing he knew, he couldn't go back to his old life, just watching through a lens. Echo had changed that, and as he met those golden eyes, he wondered, did this animal truly understand him, or was he just seeking forgiveness he'd never given himself? Ethan sat in the recovery pen, early March sunlight streaming through the window, glinting off Echo's sleek fur. The bobcat rested on a wooden perch, its golden eyes blazing as they followed him. No trace left of the weakness from weeks before. 6 weeks had passed since he'd dragged it from the icy water. 6 weeks in which he'd not only witnessed a creature's rebirth, but felt something inside himself stir back to life. But today was different. Today was the day they'd release Echo into the wild. He'd known it was coming, from the meetings with Martinez, from watching Echo pounce on prey, mice, then rabbits, with the razor-sharp instincts of a true predator. It was ready. He knew it, but his heart wasn't. He held his camera, fingers brushing the lens, snapping a shot of Echo lying there, tail flicking, ears perked. These photos weren't like the ones he'd taken in the deep woods, cold, distant, filtered through a barrier of glass. These were alive, intimate, breathing with a connection he didn't dare name. Martinez stepped in, her boots thudding on the wooden floor. "This morning," she said, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "Flathead National Forest, 20 miles out. Perfect spot, plenty of prey, few people. It'll be fine." Ethan nodded, but his throat tightened. He looked at Echo. It lifted its head, as if sensing something in the air. Preparations moved fast. Martinez administered a light sedative, just enough to keep Echo calm for the trip. Ethan helped her ease it into the transport crate, his hands trembling as they brushed its soft, dry, healthy fur. He remembered its freezing stillness that first day, how it lay limp in his arms like it had given up. Now it was a predator again, strong, proud, ready to return where it belonged. But as he latched the crate shut, Echo stirred, its golden eyes peering at him through the slats. A deep, piercing look, like a goodbye. Ethan turned away, hiding the tears welling in his eyes from Martinez. The drive to Flathead was a silent journey. Ethan drove, Martinez beside him, the crate in the back seat. He glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing Echo lying still, breathing evenly. He thought of the days at the center, how Echo had approached him in the pen, how it once sat close enough for him to feel its warmth. He'd thought it was an illusion, that a bobcat couldn't grasp gratitude. But now with release day here, he wasn't sure. All he knew was that, over these 6 weeks, Echo hadn't just been an animal he'd saved. It was part of him, a part he didn't want to lose. The release site was a clearing in the forest, ringed by towering pines and a trickling stream. Ethan parked, stepping out into the crisp early spring air that seeped through his coat. Martinez helped him carry the crate to the center of the clearing, setting it on the soft ground, facing the woods. "Want to open it?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded, kneeling beside the crate. He peered through the slats one last time. Echo was awake, golden eyes sharp, nose twitching as it caught the forest scent. "Be well, my friend," he whispered, voice breaking. "Stay safe out there." His hand touched the latch. His heart hammered. He didn't want to do this. He wanted to keep Echo, to hold on to those quiet days in the recovery pen where he wasn't alone, where he felt he mattered. But he knew that was selfish. Echo didn't belong to him. It belonged to the forest, to freedom, to its wild instincts. He took a deep breath, slid the latch. The door sprang open. Silence. Nothing happened. Ethan stepped back, Martinez at his side, both waiting. Then Echo emerged, slowly. Its sturdy legs touched the ground, nose lifting to sniff the air. It paused at the crate's edge, eyes sweeping the clearing. Ethan held his breath. He expected a bolt, a mad dash into the trees like every other wild animal he'd seen released. But Echo didn't run. It turned, looked at him, those golden eyes locked onto his, glowing in the morning light. Time stopped. Ethan felt his chest crack open, not with pain, but with something fiercer, deeper. It remembered him. He knew it. This wasn't imagination anymore. It was real. Echo stepped forward, 1 step, 2. Ethan froze, Martinez whispering, "Careful," but he wasn't afraid. Echo stopped a few feet away, then dipped its head. One paw pressed into the soft earth, firm, leaving a perfect print in the damp soil. Then it looked up, meeting his gaze one last time. A slow blink, a wordless farewell. Tears spilled from Ethan's eyes, hot against his cold face. "Thank you," he whispered, knowing it couldn't hear. Then it happened fast. Echo turned, walked away. No sprint, no panic. It moved with the calm of a predator sure of its place. Tail swished lightly, ears stood tall. Then it was gone, a shadow melting into the forest, silent as it had entered his life. Ethan stood rooted, staring where Echo had vanished. He didn't hear Martinez approach, didn't feel her hand on his shoulder. "It'll be okay," she said softly. "You gave it a second chance." But Ethan didn't answer. He knelt, gazing at the paw print Echo left behind. A small, crisp mark, like a signature etched in the earth. He touched it, trembling fingers tracing its lines. He thought of Tommy Carter, the boy he couldn't save. And now Echo, the creature he had. He couldn't erase the past, but he'd altered a future. Tears fell, soaking into the soil, mingling with the print. He stood, grabbed his camera and photographed it. Not to boast, not to sell. To keep. A piece of Echo, a piece of himself. Martinez tugged him back to the truck, but his mind lingered in the clearing. He didn't know how Echo would fare, if it would remember him as he remembered it. But as the truck rolled away from Flathead, Ethan felt a hollow in his chest. Not pain, but relief. He'd done the right thing. He'd let it go. And in that final moment, when Echo looked at him, he knew it wasn't just a bobcat. It was a friend he had to leave behind, so they could both be free. Back at the center, Martinez turned to him. "You okay?" she asked. Ethan nodded, but his eyes drifted to the forest. He wasn't okay. Not quite. But he would be, because Echo had left a mark, not just in the dirt, but in his heart. And that mark would guide him into the days ahead, where he'd face the question, had he saved Echo, or had Echo saved him? Ethan sat in his small wooden cabin, the orange glow of the table lamp casting light on the photo hung on the wall. The paw print Echo left in the soft earth the day he released it into the wild. 6 weeks had passed since then, but every glance at that picture brought back the wind whistling through Flathead Forest, the golden eyes blazing at him one last time. He sipped his coffee, warmth seeping into his palms, but it couldn't fill the void in his chest. He'd saved Echo. He'd set it free. Yet Martinez's question from the truck that day, "Did you save it or did it save you?" lingered like a ghost that wouldn't leave his mind. Days dragged on slowly since that March morning. Ethan returned to his old life, but it wasn't the same. He didn't just photograph wildlife from a distance anymore. He started writing an article for a national magazine, recounting Echo's story paired with the photos he'd taken in the recovery pen. The piece spread fast, carrying their tale to thousands. Northern Lights got more funding, more volunteers. Martinez called him once, chuckling over the phone. "You're famous now, Ethan." But fame didn't matter to him. He didn't write to brag. He wrote to hold on to something, a piece of Echo, a piece of himself. He began returning to Echo Lake Reservoir more often, bringing his camera and setting up trail cams along the shore, in the woods, hoping to prevent accidents like the one that led him to Echo. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just for the wildlife. He wanted to see it again, just once. He never told anyone, not even Martinez. But each time he checked the camera footage, his heart beat faster, waiting for a familiar shadow with those distinctive, light brown spots on its left flank. A mark he'd memorized from their days at the center. One winter morning, nearly a year after rescuing Echo, Ethan sat at his computer, a cold coffee mug beside him. He scrolled through the previous night's footage, eyes tired but glued to the screen. Then he froze. A shape appeared, swift, graceful. A bobcat stepped into frame, pausing before the camera. Ethan held his breath, hands gripping the desk. It turned its head, infrared light glinting in its golden eyes. He knew it instantly, the faint spots, the proud stance unmistakable. Echo, it was him, healthy, alive. A choked laugh escaped his throat, but what happened next stunned him. Echo dipped its head, pressing a paw into the soft earth, slowly, deliberately, then looked up, staring straight into the lens. A crisp paw print remained, identical to the one it left the day he set it free. Then it walked on, vanishing into the forest's dark embrace. Ethan replayed the footage, over and over, hands trembling on the mouse. He zoomed in on the print. Perfect, like a message. He wondered. No, he wanted to believe. It wasn't random. Echo remembered him. It knew he'd see this, but he couldn't prove it. And maybe he didn't need to. He sent the clip to Martinez. She called back instantly, her voice a mix of shock and skepticism. "I can't believe it. It's your bobcat, no doubt. But that paw print... Ethan, what do you think?" He paused, then said, "I don't know. Maybe it was just passing through. Maybe not." Martinez gave a soft laugh. "You know, Echo changed how I see these animals. They're not just wild things. They've got personality, memory. But don't let it get you down. It's thriving. That's what counts." But Ethan wasn't down. Not really. He hung the new paw print photo beside the old one, two marks side by side like an unfinished story. He started speaking about Echo at local schools, using the tale to teach kids about conservation, about the line between humans and the wild. He stressed that Echo was an exception, that no one should approach a bobcat in nature. But when the kids asked, "Do you think it remembers you?" he just smiled, saying nothing. He didn't know. He didn't need to. 5 years passed. Northern Lights thrived, thanks in part to Echo's story. Ethan kept up his photography, but now he focused on the bond between humanity and nature. Wildlife corridors, small changes people could make to protect life. He never saw Echo again, though sometimes the trail cams caught a bobcat with those familiar spots. Maybe it was him, maybe not. But each sighting sent a warm rush through him, a reminder that it was out there, somewhere in the deep woods. On a frigid winter day, near the 5-year anniversary of Echo's rescue, Ethan returned to Flathead. He stood in the clearing where he'd released it, now dusted with thin snow. He didn't bring a camera, just stood there, breathing the sharp air. The wind swept through, carrying the forest's familiar hum. He closed his eyes, picturing Echo nearby, golden eyes hidden in the shadows, watching him like before. He heard nothing, saw nothing. But when he opened his eyes, he looked down. Pristine snow, no tracks. He smiled. "Thanks, little guy," he whispered, his voice fading into the wind. Driving home, he thought of Tommy Carter, the boy he couldn't save, and Echo, the creature he had. He couldn't erase the past, but he'd found a way to live with it. Echo wasn't just a bobcat. It was a footprint in his life, one that wouldn't fade no matter the years. He didn't know if it truly remembered him, if it left those prints as a message, but he knew one thing. In the moment those golden eyes met his, he'd found forgiveness, not from Echo, but from himself. Echo's story didn't end there. It lived on in the forest, in Martinez's lectures, in Ethan's photos, in the minds of kids who heard him speak. But for Ethan, it closed with a question mark, a mystery he carried, one he didn't need to solve. He drove home, the horizon ablaze with sunset red. In his mind, Echo's departure replayed, not rushed, not afraid, just a shadow blending into the trees. And somewhere, in the wind, he heard a call, not the desperate cry from that first day, but a whisper of freedom, of life, of a bond that transcended every boundary. The tale of Ethan and Echo isn't just a rescue mission between man and wild. It's a powerful reminder of the bonds and compassion that can bridge even the widest gaps. From that freezing day at Echo Lake Reservoir, where Ethan risked everything to snatch a bobcat from death's grip, to that final moment when Echo left a paw print like a silent thank you, we witnessed something extraordinary transcending species. It didn't just transform Ethan's life, pulling him from the shadows of his past into a new light, but it leaves us with a lingering question. Could there truly be an unseen thread tying humanity to the wild? The answer's up to you, and it's waiting in stories like these. So don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel to catch more incredible journeys where nature and humanity collide, each one a story worth telling.